I know that there was a lot of commentary on the internet by many armchair analysts about, oh, India has lost the narrative. I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I think that those daily briefings were giving accurate information. The political leaders who were really in front, informing the public very early on. But I don't think that we can expect the New York Times or the BBC or the Washington Post to just all of a sudden change their ways and say, you know what, we're going to just forget about the vulnerabilities we've been making for years, forget about the omission of key information, and now right our ways. That's not going to happen. That narrative has been lost for decades. What we saw in Pahalgam is something very different coming out of India, and that was a really taking the narrative and delivering it to the world rather than a narrative about India being delivered to India. That's a positive step. I don't think I've ever seen this, at least in the past 25 years, this sort of unified response where you have people, and not just, low-level people. You have people like Shashi Tharoor, Owaisi, like people who have high profiles within their own parties who have not been shy about their disagreements with the current political party in power, coming together as a united front and sharing with the world what India has done, what it means, what the history is, how many attacks have occurred up until now, that every single war that's been fought up until this point has been instigated by Pakistan, telling India's story, not just today, but since the time of the inception of the modern nation state of India. We did an analysis of the top 50 articles, and 96% make no mention of the ethnic cleansing. Kashmir's indigenous and ancestral communities, Kashmiri Pandits, Kashmiri Hindus. Without that key piece of information, you're missing a big piece, the story.
Right.
Especially when certain outlets were trying to present tourism as some sort of covert effort to change demographics.
Yes.
Terrorism is what changed the demographics of the valley, not tourism.
Hi, you're watching the TOI Podcast, and today I'm joined by Suhag Shukla. Now, it will not be a stretch to call Suhag as the voice of a majority of Indians in the United States, as she's the co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. Welcome, Suhag, to our show. Viewers, while Suhag has been advocating for education and civil rights in the US, what really caught my eye over the last month was the manner in which Suhag reprimanded Western legacy media outlets for their lopsided narrative during the Pahalgam terror attack and its aftermath. So let me start with that, Suhag. Let's first talk about the Western media bias vis-a-vis India in general and on the Pahalgam terror attack in particular. In particular, really, I want to understand from you, why the lopsided narrative?
I mean, I think that it's a larger problem in the media generally, as far as the politicization of reportage. Before, politics were reserved to the opinion editorial page, but now it seems to have seeped into all facets. And for the longest time, there has been a left bias in the media because the media has been the bastion of the kind of political left. But what happens is that anytime you get the politics of either side, left or right, it is very susceptible to distortion, to omission, and really failing the fundamental purpose of media, which is to inform the public. But I think when we have a crisis like Pahalgam, all of those issues of the politicization, of the revenue model, all of those come to heads when we can't get accurate information about really important things that have happened in the world. And the Pahalgam attack, the terror attack, is a prime example of that.
Yeah, in particular, I want to talk about, let's say, the New York Times report, which called the Pahalgam attack quote unquote, tourists gunned down by militants in Kashmir. And frankly, it was not just NYT. They didn't even call them terrorists. It was not just NYT. Even Reuters wrote, again, militants segregated men from women and children before shooting them, instead of reporting the really religious nature of this attack. So why so far removed from reality, beyond the clickbait, of course?
So again, no answer is really simple, and I think it's multifactorial. One is a complete lack of understanding of historical context, of ground realities, and then you infuse that with politics. You're bound to get the type of reportage that we've got. Very often, in especially the Western media outlets, they have their subset of Indian origin editors, and they are absolutely inserting their politics into a lot of the storytelling about India. And they take advantage of a trust that is given to them because of the only reason is that they are of Indian origin. And somehow the other reporters or other editors who are of other ethnicities, for some reason, become blind to the fact that just because someone is of Indian origin doesn't mean they don't have a political view. And so, at least with the Pahalgam reportage, and even just India more broadly, you have many people who are in these editorial rooms that really do not like the BJP, do not like Prime Minister Modi specifically, and that tends to infuse all of the perspectives on India. So I would say, prior to 2014, I think there was a lot of ignorant reportage, lack of context, lack of historical knowledge, lack of the understanding of the variety of faiths that coexist in India, to full kind of politicking through the news pages of places like the New York Times, where they're selectively talking to resources. They put their own spin on whatever facts they have, and they omit important facts. And that leaves us with a very skewed or inaccurate picture of reality. The use of militant as opposed to terrorist is a perfect example of that. Now, initially, and I've done a couple of videos on the reportage after the terrorist attack, initially I was kind of going on just a gut feel that I'm reading, the first 5 to 10 headlines, and why are they reporting that, especially after the Resistance Front had taken credit.
Right.
And it is a known terrorist group that, fine, if you want to be a responsible journalist and say, what, let's just call it a militant attack, even though it has all of the elements of a terrorist attack. And there might not just be one definition of what terrorism is, but there's certainly several agreed upon, internationally agreed upon definitions of what terrorism is. That maybe let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not going to use these words. But once a group has taken credit, and that group is associated with a group like Lashkar-e-Taiba, which has been designated as a terrorist group by multiple governments, including Pakistan, then there's not really an excuse. At that point, you are making an editorial decision that has an effect. The editorial decision is going to downplay the role of terrorism, the role of religious hatred, and a number of other aspects.
Let me just stop you there. You spoke about that this is done largely because of anti-Modi bias, or, they don't like the BJP or Prime Minister Modi. But these tourists who were gunned down, they were not BJP guys. Neither were they. They were just average tourists, average people who'd gone there to enjoy a vacation. This is not an anti-Modi bias. This is an anti-India bias in my head. How do we explain that?
Look, I think we see it here as well with President Trump. There are certain figures in modern political history that kind of contribute to like almost a delusion of where the media, some members of the media, have taken it upon themselves to believe that it's their role to topple down governments through their position of power, of narrative. And I think that Prime Minister Modi in some sense elicits that. So at that point, we can't really have necessarily a logical conversation about, well, this is about India and it's not just about one person, that these, tourists might have been Congress supporters, might have been some other political party, or might have been completely apolitical. None of those logical arguments, I think, are going to help us break this sort of inherent bias in reportage. And, it goes beyond this. As I was looking to see, why would the BBC, for instance, the BBC, I think, is one of the worst offenders of using, really sanitized, softened language to obscure what really happened here. And if you don't know what really happened, you can't then actually fully understand the response because you've downplayed an issue of terrorism that goes well beyond this latest attack. Let's talk about the Taj Hotel, where tourists were attacked. And they were tourists who were from India. There were, of course, Indian citizens, but there were Americans, there were Europeans, there were Australians, I believe. So these become internationalized issues that we need to have a better understanding of. So, the choices that are made have a snowballing effect to not be able to understand not only the first catalyst, but also the rest of what's happening. But the BBC, after the attack by Hamas that killed nearly 1,000 or over 1,000 innocent Israelis, they refused to use the word terrorist there. So, and then they came out and tried to explain why they don't use the word. I think that the public needs to demand accuracy. That where a group attacks civilians and they have a particular political or religious ideology that's their motivating factor to attack innocent civilians, we've got to call a spade a spade. Terrorism is terrorism. We can't, can you explain maybe what the root causes of the frustrations of these individuals who then turn to this sort of just horrific violence? Is that part of the story? Absolutely. But you have to call it what it is.
The double standards are mind-blowing. I didn't see the BBC calling the 9/11 attack a militant attack on America, really. But, because this is an India-Pakistan issue, and there are many people within India who sort of also called out the Western outlets like NYT, BBC, Reuters, so many others, called them out for very slanted pro-Pakistan and anti-India coverage. Do you think, did you reach out to these Western publications over the selective coverage? What did they have to say? What was their response?
It's very hard to get a response in these days because the editorial boards are not necessarily open to calls for nuance, calls for accuracy. It's very rare that you get any sort of issuance of an apology, or a correction. Even the correction ends up sometimes, if you're lucky, you get a acknowledgement that a correction was made. But very often they'll change things, and this is not specifically to Pahalgam, but in our interactions with India generally, that if you point out an egregious error, they will fix it, but they won't even put a notice that they have. And honestly, by that time, the damage is done, especially in print. Online is a different story because we are inundated with so much information that maybe there haven't been so many eyeballs that have gone on to an inaccuracy. But in this case, we sent out a media advisory. We know that our video that was covering some of the egregious errors went viral. So surely some reporters saw that. We were tagging in an effort to inform.
Right.
But we've also sent out advisories to give people, look, let's give them the benefit of a doubt. I think in many cases it's not deserved, but in others it is. So let's give the benefit of the doubt. Let's get the history in front of them so that they have a better understanding if they're new to this topic, or even if they're just sitting in an editorial room or they're an editor, that they have a better understanding of the full story that doesn't just happen, doesn't start in April. It starts partition before partition. You have to have a long view of history, especially for these types of issues around the politics between India and Pakistan and the very formation of it. So yes, we have done our best to educate members of the media, to give them the benefit of the doubt that this isn't more politics at play as opposed to journalistic ethics, and getting the right information in front of them. And, that's the type of constructive engagement that I think is continually required. You can't just say the media's this way and never call them out and never put out, an olive branch to try to get better information in front of them.
Your take on, because, okay, Pahalgam happened and then India hit back. India, of course, the new India, as Prime Minister Modi calls it, is not going to take terror sitting down. We're going to hit back if it requires, which it did. We went and hit deep inside Pakistan. Now, the coverage of that by Western media outlets, even on the aftermath of the Pahalgam attack, when India hit back and hit terror camps in Pakistan, what we saw was headlines overwhelmingly claiming that the conflict was just a case of India and Pakistan, quote unquote, fighting yet again.
Again, it's this lack of historical context. I think that there's a couple of things at play here. One is lobbying efforts. This is the nature of politics in America. You can advocate for yourself, but you also have to have paid lobbyists who are getting your story out there, whether it's members of Congress, whether it's, whining and dining reporters. And, India has not done a great job of this. And I say this as a supporter of India, as someone of Indian origin who still has family there, and who's a close observer of ground realities, as someone who comes back to India frequently and for the past 25 years have been observing, the geopolitics around the country of my parents' origin, certainly. And in that sense, there is this thing that if you are just keeping your head down and doing your good work and doing what's right for your country, you're not that interested in telling a story. Maybe you feel that the good work will tell the story itself, but that's not the case anymore because we know that it's bad news that sells, right?
Right. On that note, I want to ask you about the multi-party delegations that the Indian government has sent out to various countries who've been out there sending India's message across on Pahalgam, on Pakistani-sponsored terror. What is your, is that having an impact? That itself, personally, is what you're talking about. It's a step in the right direction.
Yeah. So my next point would have been that up until this point, India has not done a great job, in my opinion, as an observer for the past, nearly 25 years. What I have seen in the aftermath of Pahalgam has been so comforting. It brings about confidence to say that, okay, here is a global power that is being transparent, that's being accountable, that's showing maturity. And that's not to say that those things weren't existing, but they weren't being communicated. If there were press briefings, they would be in Hindi so that the international media could not understand. If there were speeches by the prime minister or by any leader, and this goes even before the BJP, any political party, they were oftentimes in Hindi. Transcripts were not made available in English. Certainly, there weren't these multi-party. I don't think I've ever seen this, at least in the past 25 years, this sort of unified response where you have people, and not just, low-level people. You have people like Shashi Tharoor of Owaisi, like people who have high profiles within their own parties who have not been shy about their disagreements with the current political party in power, coming together as a united front and sharing with the world what India has done, what it means, what the history is, how many attacks have occurred up until now, that every single war that's been fought up until this point has been instigated by Pakistan, telling India's story, not just today, But since the time of the inception of the modern nation state of India, I think that is just such an important step that we've seen in the wake of Pahalgam, and I hope to see more of it, because not the only, but the first and foremost voice on India's story should be Indians,
Yeah.
who are aware of what's happening on the ground, who are aware of their history, and certainly they're going to have their political views on things. And I think it's fair to bring that in because India is a robust democracy, despite and in spite of what, not just legacy media, but even some of these so-called human rights groups are painting a picture of democracy in decline in India, or a lack of, media freedom and all of that. I think it's important. And I'm so pleased to see it as a observer who's oftentimes been placed in a position to try to defend, what's happening on the ground. One, why should I? I'm an American. But two, it's because there was a vacuum. There was no information coming out.
Yeah, where India is going out there and putting its voice across, speaking to the world and telling them our point of view. But let's talk about Donald Trump. You started speaking about him and then we digressed. His narrative on the ceasefire, for instance, literally putting terror sponsor Pakistan and terror victim, although I don't like to call India a victim now because I think we give it back as good as we get, but literally putting both the nations on the same pedestal. His statement on the ceasefire, for instance. How's the Indian community in the US? What's their response to that? How are they reacting to Trump's very different narrative on the ceasefire, despite India saying that it is a completely bilateral arrangement between Pakistan and India?
Yeah, I think that everyone takes these statements with a grain of salt because, initially there were statements that they were a little bit off the cuff and weren't reflective of what was actually happening. I know that there was a lot of commentary on the internet by many armchair analysts about, oh, India has lost the narrative. I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I think that those daily briefings were giving accurate information. I think that the political leaders who were really in front of informing the public very early on, I think that there was that narrative itself. But I don't think that we can expect the New York Times or the BBC or the Washington Post to just all of a sudden change their ways and say, you know what, we're going to just forget about the false equivalencies we've been making for years, forget about the omission of key information, and now right our ways. That's not going to happen. I think that narrative has been lost for decades. And what we saw in Pahalgam is something very different coming out of India. And that was a really taking the narrative and taking it and delivering it to the world rather than a narrative about India being delivered to India. And I think that that's a positive step. But as far as the Indian American community, I think, a lot of people are watching the news. They are also susceptible to misinformation, especially, I would say, generations. You have a second and third generation here who may not know the history. What I found especially jarring is seeing that virtually none, I think it was 96% of the reports. And that, we did an analysis of the top 50 articles, the ones that were read most in English speaking or English media. And 96% made no mention of the ethnic cleansing of Kashmir's indigenous and ancestral communities, Kashmiri Pandits, Kashmiri Hindus. Without that key piece of information, you're missing a big piece of, the story,
Right.
Especially when certain outlets were trying to present tourism as some sort of covert effort to change demographics.
Yeah.
Terrorism is what changed the demographics of the valley, not tourism.
Responses from lawmakers in the US to the Pahalgam terror attack. Do you see similar biases? You called out Senator Padilla's response. I saw that on social media. But what has been the larger response from lawmakers, given the fact that they America has been through 9/11. They're not immune to understanding what terrorism is all about.
Right. No, absolutely. I think on the whole, we've seen a responsive empathy, and also a response that respects India as a equal partner. Here and there, you might get, the off the cuff responses that are patronizing and not treating India as a mature democracy, one that has shown a great deal of restraint and responsibility. But there is that one instance that I think got a lot of attention with the response from Senator Padilla's office. And there, I think that the community has also shown maturity. We've shown that we're not going to just sit quietly and not engage and then just go through this woe is me, that everyone's against us. I don't think that can define the Indian American community anymore either. I think with second and third generations now who are well versed in the system and are very much American, and that includes organizations like ours, the Hindu American Foundation. We launched a letter writing campaign first just to elicit statements of condemnation from members of Congress. And then when we saw this really patronizing letter come from Padilla's office, we called that out too. We launched a second action alert in which our members in California sent a letter to say, this is unacceptable. Don't wrist slap and give a lecture on religious freedom. That whole topic in and of itself has been so politicized to the point of obscuring what the actual ground realities are. And we know that because there's amazing surveys like the one done by the Pew Research Forum that actually shows that the story of India of peaceful coexistence between different religious communities and different social communities is on the whole very positive and is one of peaceful coexistence and cooperation. So, the fact that we got so many people taking action back to back, because oftentimes with activism, people won't take even the extra step of clicking a button. Everyone is more about talking about their frustrations, but when it comes to taking action, people don't. We had a remarkable response, and I think that the response from the office shows the power of collective action. There was an apology that was issued saying that initial note was sent out in error, and we know that this can happen. Look, these offices are staffed with young people who might have just taken a form letter and sent it out. Sure. They saw, India, human rights. So let's give the benefit of the doubt. I think we need to look more at the response afterwards when the error was brought to their attention. We also met with the office and had a very constructive conversation. This person is going to be in office for, the near future and perhaps the long future. We have a choice. Either we build a constructive relationship with them so that anytime some sort of resolution or bill or anything comes in front of their desk, they turn to us to say, well, you tell us, what do you want us to do as constituents? And second, as subject matter experts, those people who are close to the situation or have better resources or sources on the ground that can give us the information, let us turn to you. That is what a healthy, functioning democracy looks like.
I think that's a remarkable achievement under your belt. But moving beyond Pahalgam and the narrative and everything else, tell me, why the need for a Hindu American organization in the U.S.?
So, many times we even get this question from our own community, why not Indian American?
Yeah.
And I think that I think we need both. We need Indian American representation because India is a secular democracy, and the diaspora as a reflection of India is multi-religious, and it is, very diverse politically, religiously, etc. So there are definitely those issues that we can advocate under a Indian origin umbrella or an Indian American umbrella. But there are specific issues that affect the Hindu community that under an Indian banner, because you're bringing together a diverse coalition where you may not agree on everything. So oftentimes those points where we don't agree or it's not a priority under an Indian banner are the reason why we need a Hindu American banner. So for instance, the religious worker visa. That is a visa that is a visa program, a non-immigrant visa program, where our community depends on it in order to get pandits and pujaris to staff our temples. Because we don't have those institutions that do those traditional trainings for, the rituals and other practices that we need to maintain a temple. Under an Indian banner, that might not be a priority to advocate for, but certainly as a Hindu community, we know that our temples depend on it. Other things like hate crimes, where hate crimes go beyond just, say, xenophobia and ethnic hatred and are veering into Hindu hatred. Again, under an Indian banner where you have a multi-religious coalition, you may not be able to tackle those issues without actually unraveling the coalition that you pulled together. So one example of that is we've seen a spike of attacks against Hindu mandirs. We've seen that in the United States. We've seen that in Canada. And we've also seen it in Australia. And at the root cause of these is Khalistani extremism. So here you have an issue that, yes, it has political underpinnings, but it also has religious underpinnings. And that's where a Hindu American banner is helpful. And the last piece is education. The Hinduism, and more broadly speaking, even ancient India and its history, are introduced in K through 12 education here in the United States in public school, generally around 6th grade, sometimes 9th grade. And an Indian organization may try to tackle the Indian history piece of it, but they're not going to be able to tackle necessarily how Hinduism as a world religion is portrayed. And that's where having kind of the laser focus on Hindu American issues is really important to ensure that we are advocating for and protecting the rights for our multi-layered identities.
Interesting. And what sort of do people come to you with problems? Do you reach out to? How does it work?
Absolutely. So, we've been around for nearly 25 years, and we see that there's certain niche issues. Certainly textbooks has been a big issue and one that we've been on the forefront of. We get approached by educators, and these are American, school teachers or administrators who understand that their subject matter expertise in Hinduism is limited. So they come to us to say, hey, we've gotten complaints from parents, for instance. Can you help us in ensuring that we are teaching about Hinduism in an accurate manner, in a respectful manner? We get calls from employees who are facing religious discrimination or religious challenges in the workplace. So here, because religious liberty is a constitutional right, and we also have other statutory laws that protect religious freedom, an employer should not discriminate against you if you're asking for, say, time off or an accommodation to accommodate your religious practice. So suppose you you have a family member who has passed away and you need to go to India for dispersion of the ashes, for instance.
Right.
If your vacation is rejected, but you are going because of a religious reason, that's something that's protected. So we have educational programs that, first of all, educate employees, Hindu American employees, of their rights, but we also have programs that educate employers of what their obligation is to accommodate religious practice. So these are just some. We've also had, people coming to us where it was an interfaith marriage, for instance, and they're facing divorce. And now the two parents are trying to navigate how they both can have equal say in how the children are raised in two different faiths, giving support to the Hindu parent in articulating to the courts what Hindu practice for that particular individual might look like. So these are kind of just a wide range of the issues, and also like hate crime prevention, a number of like broader state level issues that we work on.
Right. You mentioned visas in a previous answer. I mean, at this point in time, with Trump, with the shadow of Trump's very America first policies hanging over the fate of many Indian students, so many Indian students probably wondering what's going to happen next there. What are they sort of thinking? What's happening? Is there really a threat for Indian students, like, for instance, the Chinese students, which Marco Rubio cracked down on a few days ago?
I think there's a great deal of uncertainty and fear amongst our community. We are a largely immigrant community, and we went from just 400,000 in the 1980s to now close to 5 million. So we've had rapid growth, and that rapid growth is the result of immigration. So, it makes sense as to why there's fear and uncertainty. We already had a broken system. You have people who come on H-1Bs who then apply for a green card, and then they are in a long waiting line, some, decades long before you're going to be eligible for getting your actual green card and then becoming a citizen. So it's a very long process, one that has a lot of inherent problems in it of children aging out if you applied for your children, and them having to maintain their status, of potentially abuse in the workplace, because when you are on an H-1B, you can't just move around to different employers, so that it creates an environment that's fraught for abuse. But now you have an added layer of uncertainty with crackdowns on student activism and real questions being asked that, does the First Amendment right to free speech extend to students? And I think that oftentimes we're seeing that the executive branch is taking action before the judicial branch has an opportunity to weigh on. And so we have separation of powers for a reason. We need to make sure that there's due process in any of these instances because there's a downstream effect. Right now, there might be the politics at play, and it captures headlines, and it's, making good on campaign promises. But is it the right thing for America? What sorts of precedents are we creating when we do these types of crackdowns where we're not sticking by the guarantee of due process to make sure that the law is being applied? So we're hearing from members of the community who are unsure of what they can and cannot do, especially in the advocacy space, because we know that there's been some high-profile cases of students being deported because they wrote an opinion editorial. So then you have plenty of people who are on H-1Bs, for instance, and they're saying, well, can I write to my congressman without a risk? So these are legitimate fears. We have held we've held at least one webinar where we had a immigration attorney come on and answer questions, especially during the first incidents of these high-profile deportations. And we are in the midst of creating other resources, educational resources for the community. We are also uncertain because there's the law as it's been written, and then there's the law as it's being tested. We're trying to navigate this carefully so that we don't misinform, and that we also allay some of the fears and try to help people in our community make a distinction between what are the fears that are rational, what are the fears that are maybe a little bit more media driven, because those are the stories that capture the headlines. And then there's the reality of the situation where there's many, many people who are not being affected by some of these crackdowns.
So, in your head, and from your understanding, how much of these, should Indian students really be scared? On a scale of 1 to 10, what should be in your understanding? Because we get a lot of anxious parents asking us, they're the students who are preparing to go to the US for their studies now, but they're all asking whether is it really a good idea?
It's a tough question. I want to say you should not be scared. You should be very well aware of all the fine print when you apply for a visa. I think before we kind of go through paperwork and we don't read the fine print, what can you and can you not do? Turn to us if you have any specific questions. We are here. We have a legal justice center. And if we don't have an attorney on staff that can answer that question, we certainly have a network that we can turn to for any specific questions. But I think that Indian students have shown that they are very positive, presence on college campuses. They've gone on to pursue graduate degrees and be part of the startup culture here. And they're contributing to corporate America in very positive ways and very concrete, substantive ways. I think that, there are the thing about America is that it is a noisy and rambunctious democracy.
Just like India.
Exactly. And where we see that fairness and due process is perhaps not being honored and it's not giving it the place that it should in our democracy, there are plenty of Americans who are speaking out against it and doing things for it. So, does it feel a little bit like walking into a tornado? Possibly. But I would just say, just be informed of, what are your rights and responsibilities as a student on a visa. And the same thing with, workers on an H-1B visa or whatever visa that you're on. Know what your rights are, know what your responsibilities are.
All right. Thank you, Suhag. I think that's a message I think will resonate very widely with people who are in the US and people who in India who are planning to go to the US, whether on H-1B visas or whether on student visas. But I'm going to let you go now, but not before I ask you one question, which has been, it's been on my head for a long time. I was going through this Pew Research survey, and it said that 18% Americans who were born into Hinduism do not identify as Hindus anymore. Is there a trend there? Is that something that you are working towards? Your organization is looking to do something about it? Or do you think it's just 18%, so it's not a big deal?
No, I think 18% is a big deal. I think that's, roughly 1 in 5 people. I come from a family of 4. So, that if you put it in those terms at a very granular level, I think that's a thing that we should be concerned with. I think it's, again, multifactorial. We have a general trend towards irreligion. So could that be a part of it? Absolutely. But I think for every challenge, which I think 18% no longer identifying as Hindu is a challenge, I think it presents an opportunity. What can we as an institution do to make sure that our communities have the tools to be able to preserve and pass on our tradition? Because I think that the Hindu tradition is one that it has a deep value. We are here in spite of numerous times over history where there were serious threats to our way of life, but we are still here where other ancient civilizations are not, because I think that the philosophy offers the tools to navigate the ups and downs of life, especially when we're in an age where mental health concerns are, of utmost priority. I think our tradition with practices like yoga and Ayurveda and meditation are an antidote to some of the ailments of modern life. So we're going to do our best to make sure that we have resources for parents who are struggling. They don't know how to pass on the tradition, because it's very different to move to a country where you are less than 1% of the population and you're surrounded by a different culture, to be able to preserve yours and to be able to pass it on to your children where their peers are their greatest influence. And I think that it presents an opportunity, and one that we are really excited to take by the horns.
All right. More power to you. Thank you for speaking to us. I'm sure your message is going to resonate with a lot of Indians who are not just in the US, but also back home here. But thank you for speaking to us and giving us those perspectives.
Great.
Yes, thank you so much.